For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started. Yes, there is plenty of evidence that dinosaurs lived with man and even went on Noah's Ark. All you have to do is mention the word dinosaur on Noah's Ark or dinosaurs living with man in, say, recent times will lead to scoffing from the atheists, from the evolutionists. But the fact is, this evidence of dinosaurs living with man and that the Bible's history of this universe is accurate is overwhelming. There's actual historic, scientific, and even eyewitness evidence, ample evidence for this. And the fact is that more and more evidence actually continues to be discovered, which actually proves that everything we've been taught about dinosaurs is absolutely wrong. Dinosaurs have been documented in history by eyewitnesses. A few examples that come to mind are Alexander the Great, Marco Polo, Herodotus. You can look for yourself. There exists massive amounts of cave drawings, mosaics, paintings, scriptures, sculptures of dinosaurs from ancient Egypt, Cambodia, Europe, Australia, North America, pretty much all over the earth. And in the scripture, we see the description of dinosaur-like animals: Leviathan, Behemoth. The word dragon is used over and over again. And these sculptures, mosaics, paintings, cave drawings that I talk about, you can actually go see them yourself. We even have documentation of the existence of completely fresh, non-fossilized dinosaur bones. What is unfortunate is that people have been brainwashed, and not only brainwashed, but conditioned to believe that these dinosaurs are actually prehistoric animals, beasts that lived until about 65 million years ago. But the fact is, these evolutionary scientists, they're dedicated to convincing you that dinosaurs lived long before man. Because what they have to do, they're like salesmen, evolutionary salesmen. They have to sell you the story, the fairy tale that comes right out of SpongeBob La La Land. That pine trees, whales, and dinosaurs are all related through common ancestry. So if dinosaurs were actually alive within the last few thousand years, this theory of evolution, pond scum to people evolution, becomes highly unlikely. Now, dinosaurs to begin with, they're nothing more than reptiles that continue to grow in size. And most people that I talk to, most people that you will talk to, they seem to be unaware of the fact that reptiles never stop growing in size while they're alive. For example, as humans, we know that our noses and ears never stop growing. And same with mammals and most of the animal kingdom. They grow to a certain size, then stop growing. While they do get older, they don't get any bigger. But with reptiles, as I've stated earlier, they continue to grow in size until the day they die. Let's take a tortoise that has lived over 100 years. It's known and documented that they get to be the size of a bathtub. Imagine a tortoise that could live up to 500 years. They'd be the size of a garage. Now, when we actually examine dinosaurs, and if we look to the biblical record of history, say before Noah's flood, we know that man lived to be hundreds of years old. Methuselah, for example, lived to be 969 years old. And after the flood, when the lifespan of man was decreased based on the after effects of the flood, based on genetic entropy, the accumulation of low impact, deleterious mutations, the ages of man have dropped off. Take that back to a point of, say, least genetic entropy. Imagine if these animals had the ability to live that long as well. We know today that reptiles never stop growing in size throughout their entire lifetime. Therefore, picture a Komodo dragon, picture a gecko. What are they going to look like after 500 years? Can you say dinosaur? Now, to not get into too much detail about the biblical evidence, let's look at the evidence of dinosaurs living with man in recent history. Because like I said earlier, it's overwhelming due to the countless artifacts, drawings, mosaics, carvings, depictions. You can see depictions of Brachiosaurus, plesiosaurs, pterodactyls, triceratops, T-Rex, and many, many more. The question is, for the evolutionists, if man didn't live with these creatures, how did artists throughout ancient history and in cultures all over the world happen to draw these animals, to recreate these giant beasts? Was it just all coincidence that it turns out that they look nearly identical to what we see in the books about dinosaurs in museums today? I've heard evolutionists say, well, they must have seen dinosaur skeletons back then too, and that's how they were able to recreate them and draw them. And it's not just a coincidence. They've seen the bones. But the thing is, this argument fails tremendously. And the reason why is that dinosaur skeletons, they're not just found lying on the ground intact, as if someone's going to walk by, look down and see what that dinosaur looked like. The bones are always fragmented, they're separated, and they're embedded deep within the ground or within the rock. And most of them are missing. Occasionally, yes, you might find a piece of a single bone, say, sticking out of a rock here and there. But at the end of the day, that's pretty much all that we actually find. And if you actually think about this logically, what does logic say? That's all anyone in ancient history would have been able to find as well. And there's no way they would have been able to create that image of the entire animal, the entire dinosaur, without the entire skeleton. We know that the science of paleontology did not develop until the early 1800s. It's all rescue device after rescue device and post hoc, ad hoc explanations coming from the evolutionist side. This process of digging out and excavating dinosaur bones from, say, rock didn't begin until then. And as a consequence, the first complete skeleton of a dinosaur was not constructed until the 1800s. The word dinosaur, which everybody knows means, great or terrible lizard, it didn't exist before 1841. That's when it was coined. But that doesn't mean dinosaurs didn't exist. It just means that these giant animals, these reptiles, these creatures weren't called dinosaurs before 1841. This is what logic dictates. They were called dragons. And what do we see? Thousands of dragon legends from cultures all around the world. Dragon sightings have been documented and recorded throughout history by eyewitnesses. They've been part of all sorts of legends and cultures all around the earth, from China to England to everywhere. And as I said earlier, there's even over 20 references to dinosaurs in the Bible. But of course, if the word dinosaur wasn't coined until 1841, they were not called dinosaurs, they were called dragons, since the word didn't exist yet. This all fits perfectly within a biblical base model. So how did these people 2,000-3,000 years ago, how did they know almost exactly what dinosaurs look like? Listen guys, there's only two options. Either logically, they saw the dinosaurs with their own eyes, or they could have constructed the skeletons. There's not really a third logical option that won't sound ridiculous at the end of the day. So if we actually look into these explanations, and we look at, say, civilizations throughout history, to think that they actually knew exactly what dinosaurs looked like in detail by just seeing, dinosaur skeletons, at the end of the day, that's not logical. Because as I said earlier, the first skeleton was not even put together until the 1800s. And there's not as many dinosaur skeletons as you'd think. The fossil record, we can look to paleontologist Dr. Kurt Wise. He's got a PhD in geology from Harvard University. He'll tell you this is confirmed. This is fact that only 0.0025% of the entire fossil record consists of more than a single bone of vertebrate animals. And after nearly hundreds of years, 200 years to be exact, of paleontology, we have now been able to come up with just a few fossils of large dinosaurs. And there's almost no evidence in history of previous civilizations digging and excavating bones, let alone creating entire skeletons, as some of these evolutionary apologists would have you believe. But remember, they need to hang on to that primary assumption that pond scum to people evolution is true. At best, if you want to give them something, someone in history maybe found an occasional large bone shard, say in the ground, and tell their buddies, okay, this belonged to some type of big animal, but it's not logical at all. As a matter of fact, it's illogical to believe that they could, with their imagination, guess exactly what, say, a Tyrannosaurus or a Brachiosaurus or a Triceratops would look like. Or any other dinosaurs for that matter. I could go on and on and on. Plesiosaurs, for example. You know, how would they know that these depictions were identical to what they actually look like? The ones that we see in these artworks, the cave drawings, the sculptures, the mosaics, and writings. Writings that we can go into thoroughly throughout history and from many different cultures around the world. Usually, and what it is about legends, thousands of legends, is they come from a common source. Ask yourself, whether you're a believer, you're on the fence, or you're a critic, if these dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago before modern man evolved, and the first dinosaur skeleton was then not excavated and constructed until the early 1800s, how did human artwork throughout all of history just so perfectly manage to come out and depict several types of dinosaurs that look absolutely identical to the dinosaur depictions we see in the science books today? It's a simple answer, guys, as everything is. Start with a biblical-based model, a biblical-based assumption. What's the answer? They drew what they saw with their own eyes.
Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee.
God knew what the objections would be, and he's already covering it right here. I made Behemoth with thee.
He eateth grass as an ox. Lo now, his strength is in his loins, and the force is in the navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his stones are wrapped together.
And Behemoth is clearly a dinosaur. If you just look at the sheer size, the proportions, and when it talks about he moves his tail like a cedar, and then people say, oh, it's an elephant. Have you ever seen an elephant's tail? A cedar doesn't come to mind. Okay.
Doesn't really matter what young Earth creationists believe Leviathan and Behemoth were, because we know for a fact that non-avian dinosaurs went extinct over 65 million years before man was ever around.
This is how education works today in America. It's just everybody's taught, hey, listen, evolution's a fact. The Big Bang's a fact. The Earth being billions of years old is a fact. Just deal with it. And nobody wants to question it, because then they're going to be seen as ignorant, uneducated.
Not to mention you would fail the class.
Hey guys, hope you're having a great day. Thank you so much for watching Beyond the Science. It's Mikey Chen. When we think of dinosaurs and humans, we never associate them with each other because they supposedly belong to completely different time periods. Dinosaurs first sparked people's curiosities in the 1820s when scientists found huge bones of an unknown reptile in the English countryside. Ever since then, dinosaurs have been favorites of children and adults, probably because they're extinct and can no longer eat us. Their sheer size and uniqueness have inspired many documentaries, movies, and stories alike. Humans, on the other hand, according to scientists, are relatively new to Earth compared to the large lizards. That means that humans and dinosaurs never coexisted, much less interacted with each other, right? And although many people believe that it's impossible for humans and dinosaurs to have coexisted, there has been clues from fossils, paintings, ancient sculptures, and more that tells a slightly different story. One of these clues was found in May of 2012 when the brow horn of a Triceratops was excavated in Dawson County, Montana that was dated to around 33,500 years ago. Triceratops, a name that means three-horned face, is believed to have first appeared during the Cretaceous period around 68 million years ago and became extinct after around 2 million years. The Triceratops brow horn found in Montana was stored at the Glendive Dinosaur and Fossil Museum, which sent a sample of the outer portion of the horn to the Paleochronology group in order to carry out carbon-14 dating. The head of the Paleochronology group, Hugh Miller, then sent the sample to the University of Georgia for that exact purpose. For those of you who aren't familiar with carbon-14 dating, it's basically the way to find the age of certain artifacts with biological origins up to around 54,000 years old. Carbon-14 was never used to test dinosaur bones in the past because, like I mentioned, it's only reliable up to 55,000 years. But that's only because scientists thought that it was useless to test bones that belong to creatures that became extinct 65 million years ago. Because of this, methods such as radiometric dating of volcanic layers is typically used to test dinosaur bones, which yielded results that were more based on assumption. It became clear years ago that paleontologists were not just neglecting to test dinosaur bones for C14 content, but were refusing to. After the Triceratops brow horn sample was sent to the University of Georgia for C14 testing, it was divided at the lab into two fractions. One fraction yielded an age of 33,570 plus or minus 120 years, and the other an age of 41,010 plus or minus 220 years. The reason why they split the sample into two fractions was because it reduced the possibility for errors. The C14 test results that came out were not surprising to the Paleochronology group because they had carried out the test on dinosaur bones before. All of the results date back to thousands of years instead of millions of years. A model created by the group in 2003 showed that dinosaur bones had C14 that ranged from 22,000 to 39,000 years. Another discovery came in the form of soft tissue found in dinosaur fossils in March of 2005. According to paleontologist Mary Schwitzer, the soft tissue was discovered inside a 68 million year old T-Rex leg bone from Montana. But researchers were able to rehydrate the tissue and prove the existence of blood vessels, blood matrix, and connective tissue. This is really strange because scientists had previously believed that tissue proteins are supposed to degrade in a million years or less, even in the best of conditions, indicating that the bone belonged to a T-Rex that most likely died less than a million years ago. What's more, a small ceratopsian dinosaur that lived approximately 70 million years ago was actually carved by the Hongshan culture, a Neolithic culture in northeastern China. The carving was made out of jade and looks exactly like a Montanoceratops. In addition, Marco Polo also recorded that he saw a 50-foot reptile in 1100 AD with, quote, jaws large enough to swallow a man and a tail so heavy it left a trail in the sand as if a heavy beam had been dragged across.
In 1994, the esteemed journal Science shocked the scientific world by publishing sequence data from DNA retrieved from dinosaur bone thought to be 80 million years old. DNA is a fragile molecule, and so it breaks down quickly. Measurements of DNA stability suggest that it could only last thousands of years, at best, only under perfect conditions. But 80 million years was just too incredible for skeptical scientists. Eventually, these skeptics were vindicated, as it became apparent that the original researchers had sequenced contaminated human DNA, not dinosaur DNA. However, in 2012, a different group of researchers published new results supporting the discovery of actual dinosaur DNA. These new results eventually became impossible to disprove or avoid, with the researchers applying multiple checks against contamination from non-dinosaur sources. The preservation of dinosaur DNA doesn't make any sense from an evolutionary perspective, but it fits the biblical history whereby dinosaurs lived thousands of years ago, not millions of years ago. Evolutionists have to invoke rescuing devices to get around these problems, like usual. How do you think our view of dinosaurs would change if everyone knew scientists found carbon-14 in their bones? Well, a group of geophysicists have discovered exactly that, carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. This is indeed a shocking proposal for those who believe that the last dinosaur died out 65 million years ago, because carbon-14 decays so fast that it could not possibly survive that long. There should be not one atom of carbon-14 present in dinosaur bones if they are really as old as they claim to be. After going to great lengths to rule out contamination, the researchers concluded that they had indeed found carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. These results seriously undermine the evolutionary story of long ages in Earth's history. However, they fit nicely with the biblical history where dinosaurs lived only thousands of years ago. In the early 90s, researchers from Montana State University made an amazing discovery. Inspecting a piece of T-Rex bone under a microscope, they could hardly believe their eyes. They could see dinosaur red blood cells. This discovery prompted lead scientist Mary Schweitzer to say, "It is exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone, but of course I couldn't believe it." I said to the lab technician, "The bones after all are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long?" In a Discover magazine article, Dr. Schweitzer explained further her response. "If you take blood cell samples and you stick them on the shelf, you have nothing recognizable in about a week." Why would there be anything left in dinosaurs? Well, the only reason there would be anything left in dinosaurs comes down to there being iron in the blood. However, this excuse falls short, as you are about to see. But first, let's touch on two other reasons that this cannot happen. As I am explaining these two other major problems with why dinosaur bones cannot be 65 million years old, look at all the findings of soft tissue discovered recently and how they know to look for it now, rather than just assume it doesn't exist at all. Problem number one, the mostly left-handed amino acids that should be equally right-handed and left-handed if they were Jurassic. They are not there. The laws of chemistry demonstrate that after death, amino acids go back to a 50-50 mixture of right and left-handed amino acids. The England's Royal Society published a time range for when this physical process to occur, which produces totally racemized amino acid in 100,000 to 1 million years maximum. So, obviously, that is not even close to 65 million years old. Another problem, the amino acid methionine is very susceptible to strong oxidizing agents like hydrosol, which would quickly oxidize methionine into methionine sulfoxide. The Nature Communication study results revealed unoxidized methionine in some of the Alberta dinosaur specimens. Also consider this. The research on the Egyptian mummies has established a 10,000-year upper limit for how long biological molecules can survive. Now, back to iron for just a moment. If you want to see the rescuing device for iron preservation fail in real time, it's easy. Just look for yourself. One of the most striking examples of soft tissue preservation in dinosaur fossils. If you look at the photos in the paper, you see no evidence of iron particles. The only place she saw iron was inside partially degraded tissue. You see, iron in blood, which gets released at death, cannot preserve all soft tissue decay for millions of years because it still degrades collagen proteins, which have also been found in some specimens. So while iron might preserve some soft tissue, it obviously is not responsible for all soft tissue preservation. Also consider that iron would be incapable of preserving soft dinosaur tissue if it could actually distribute it from the dinosaur's blood throughout all the tissue. Of course, Mary Schweitzer and her team totally submerged specimens to preserve them to obtain the results they desired. But the only way to accomplish this naturally is distributed by water. Well, guess what? That brings up another huge problem, as water also degrades soft tissue before iron can preserve it. In addition to this, soft tissue has also been found in bones not directly associated with iron-rich blood, like in the bone horn of the Triceratops and bird feathers. More problems with iron preservation with microbiologist Kevin Anderson later in this video. The old Earth idea was developed historically, not from letting the physical facts speak for themselves, but by imposing anti-biblical philosophical assumptions onto their geological observations, the idea driving the conclusion.
Well, we were looking at dinosaur fossils. The bones have been fossilized from dinosaurs. And these honestly look more like rocks to me, but they're, what do you have here? What are you studying?
Well, this actually is not a bone. These are fragments of a Triceratops horn.
Okay.
In 2012, the Creation Research Society sponsored Mark Armitage and I to go to the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, which is a very popular place for finding dinosaur bones, and we instead dug out a Triceratops brow horn. Now, it's just in crumbled pieces now, so we can't really, put it together and show you a horn. And what we've done, of course, is have to work with it where you actually destroy portions of it. But you have to recognize that inside that rock-looking structure are tissue, cells, and protein still there.
All right, so let's go back for a second, because if this horn or part of a dinosaur had been buried for millions and millions of years, you would not expect to still be able to see tissue. But are you saying that's what we're finding?
That is absolutely what we're finding. In fact, in a Nature communication paper in 2015, they referred to it as common.
So is this unusual for those who have followed the traditional paradigm associated with when dinosaurs lived and when they died?
It would certainly be not at the least expected. In fact, Mary Schweitzer, who was the first one to really make this popularized, the first one to really get discoveries that were noticed by a wide range of scientists, she comments in interviews that she had her technicians repeat the study over and over and over again, simply because it's so difficult to understand how you could have this material still in a dinosaur fossil that is supposed to be 65, 70, 75, 80 million years of age. Because any competent biochemist knows that tissue, cells, proteins break down. They're not concrete, they don't just exist for eons of time, they break down. And in fact, they tend to break down fairly quickly depending upon the conditions. And certainly in Hell Creek, the conditions would be warm up, cool down, warm up, cool down. We found this horn, for example, just a mere 1 foot below the surface. So there was no thermal protection by being deep in the ground. So it would have been very much subjected to fluctuations of hot and cold and hot and cold. And any biochemist can tell you that is the fastest way to destroy material. It's difficult enough to envision it surviving for 4,000 or 5,000 years, but 60 million years, 70 million years, see, that really becomes very difficult to make any kind of biochemical basis for how it could have survived.
Okay, well, let's talk now about what you do with these, okay? You've got these here. What would be your standard process of wanting to then examine?
Well, as you can see, these look like a rock. So what you have to do is you have to literally dissolve the rock away. So what we do is we soak the fossil material in a solution called EDTA. It's a very mild acid that will grab the calcium ions out of the fossil. And so you just literally dissolve the fossil. And what you'll have after you dissolve the fossil is the tissue will be remaining, because the EDTA won't dissolve the tissue.
So where are you now in this process? What would be your next step?
Well, some of these have just started, but the next step would be then we would take and we'd pour off the solution.
Okay.
Right now, I'm not worried about what's in here. I will collect that and analyze it at some point later. But right now, I'm just wanting to look at this.
What's left there?
Right.
Okay.
So then I'll bring this over to what we call a dissection microscope. As you can see, what we see is this is, in essence, dissolved Triceratops horn magnified.
Well, Kevin, what did you find then when you were looking at the sample and you actually found some tissue?
Okay, here's what we found. Here we have a piece of the horn that has been decalcified, like what I just showed you over on the bench. Mark Armitage was our microscopist working on this, and Mark then took a piece of the decalcified horn and put it under a microscope. See the fibrous material there? That's part of the composition of the bone matrix itself. But what's really of interest is see the white material here on the surface swaying back and forth? That's actual dinosaur tissue on the surface. See, this is not a solid fossil. This has got tissue characteristic to it. See, notice how it flexes back. And that's, of course, very interesting, how you pull on it, flexes back, pull on it, flexes back. That's characteristic of tissue. That's what tissue would do. Now, Mark then was able to extract some very thin layers of elastic material away from the inner core of the horn. But he didn't have to decalcify the horn in order to do this. You can see it's stretchy, it's flexible. In fact, look, notice, see how it's stretching? It's stretching almost to twice its original size of what it was. See, this again is original dinosaur tissue that he's peeled directly from the fossil. There was no decalcification that he did first. See, this is how accessible this tissue was. He didn't have to remove any fossilized bone to get to this tissue. Okay, now, here is a light microscope picture of the tissue itself. You can see the texture of it. And in fact, see, notice the arrows, they're pointing to cells. These cells specifically are what we call osteocytes. Those are bone cells. They're involved in making bone, because even though we think of bone as a rock, bone is tissue. Bone is not a rock. In fact, in our bodies, bone is replaced about every 10 years to keep it all fresh and the new matrix laid down and such. So it's constantly being changed, and that's what those cells do. And if you look at them then at a closer magnification, what we see then, this is using scanning electron microscopy, you see the extreme detail of the cells. See how well that's preserved. I mean, that doesn't speak for something that has been degrading or something that has just been in a non-pristine condition for 65, 70 million years. We would not begin to expect to see such enormous and elaborate detail. I mean, these structures are incredibly small. You know, this is our 20 micron bar here, and see how small these structures are, still intact. And yet, to see that kind of detail, then obviously the preservation process is surprising, really, to everybody. But I think as creationists, we have a lot less to explain than someone trying to suggest that this is, 65, 70 million years of age.
Well, let me ask you this first, because, I mean, this is an incredible picture. And I just want to make sure we're not looking at fossilized material here, fossilized tissue. That's been replaced by calcium.
These are the cells.
These are real cells.
Correct.
Well, Kevin, I understand you published all of this work.
Yes,
is that right?
This work has been published. We've actually made the cover of American Laboratory. We also published in a journal called ACTA Histochemica, and that's a more technical article. It goes through and explains then what we did, how we processed the horn, and then of course draws some conclusions from that. Particularly the conclusions are that even though it's a horn, which is different from a bone, it still had tissue. Even though it was wet when we pulled it out of the ground, it had what we call matrix, which is another word for mud. It still had tissue, so just a different specimen than what had been analyzed before. No one had done a horn before. Now we start getting closer, and what you're going to see then is you're going to see little pieces of tissue there, and that's what you're going to pick off and then put under the higher powered microscope. Okay, and then under the higher powered microscope, see, now we look at the tissue itself, and there's the cells.
It's fascinating.
See, and then there's another. And like I say, those are very specific osteocytes. Now, those osteocytes have a very unique structure. Okay, now we're coming into some of the texture of the horn itself. And see, this would be a blood vessel. And if you look, you see, this is dissolved away. This would be the interior of the horn. And you can see all the detail that'd be left in there after you take the calcium away. And then there, of course, is an osteocyte.
So that has to have shaken up the scientific community. What's been the response of all of this?
The initial response, when Dr. Schweitzer first published her work, which is what became very popularized in 2005, it generated a lot of response that previous papers had not generated. And there's kind of a question of exactly why it generated so much response. But in 2005, her paper was published in the journal Science, which is a very broad distributed journal, very highly respected journal. Color pictures You know, you can't minimize the impact of color pictures. So you had people that would be more biochemistry and biology backgrounds that maybe for the first time paid attention to this. So that generated, I think, some not only publicity for it, but certainly some controversy. And so initially some of the reaction was rejection. Oh, it's contamination. You know, that's not really dinosaur, it's microscopic artifact, it's bacteria, because bacteria can look kind of strange sometimes. So you had a lot of proposals of what it could be. And to her credit, Dr. Schweitzer did more work, which is what science is. She did more analytical work, dug deeper. They began to find protein. You break open some of these cells. You look at the matrix these cells are attached to, and they're protein. Particularly one of the common proteins they found is called collagen. Now, collagen is the most common protein in any vertebrate. Vertebrate meaning those animals that have spinal columns. Collagen is the most dominant protein. It's a hardy protein, but there was no reason based on any kind of biochemistry known about collagen, any kind of biochemistry of how collagen degrades. There was no reason to think that collagen could naturally, easily survive for 65, 70 million years.
And all of that research, did it lead towards the conclusion that it's not bacteria, it's not something that
It very
invaded
much
it?
did, right. That you can dismiss the bacteria idea, you can dismiss the contamination idea. It is real dinosaur tissue, real dinosaur cells, and real dinosaur protein.
Okay, so once that is understood,
Yes.
then what happens? Now this is shaking it up, I guess.
That becomes part of the controversy because clearly you're now faced with how could you explain the survival of this, the pristine survival of this, not only for so long, but in very unpristine conditions. There's nothing pristine about Hell Creek, Montana, for example. It's not permafrost. It's not like these were in a deep freeze for millions of years. Like we mentioned before, the temperature fluctuations, water. You know, water will degrade proteins. When we pulled the horn out of the ground, it had water underneath it just from the seepage of rainwater. That's why when we first dug the horn out, we thought, oh, there's nothing gonna be in there. And there was. So these are not dry, they're not sealed in some kind of, stainless steel vault. They're subjected to all kinds of conditions that would degrade this stuff. And so then the controversy has been, how do you explain it? And if you read some of the literature, there's almost like desperation of, would you guys please explain this? Because they recognized what the implications of this could be. Now, some people would claim, well, it means nothing because we know how old they are and therefore it just means it survived somehow, big deal. But how do you know how old they are? Well, you used methods, supposed methods of dating. Well, this is a method of dating. The tissue itself can't be discounted as part of a method of dating. So why do you say that doesn't count, but this does count? Well, it's all the paradigm drives your conclusions. The paradigm is it has to be old, therefore methods that give us an old fossil are what we choose. Something that doesn't give us an old fossil, like tissue, we have to reject or explain away. And the big push at the moment is to explain it away, to come up with some explanation of how the tissue survived. There are several ideas out there. The most popular one at the moment is the one that Mary Schweitzer herself has proposed, where she proposed that in red blood cells you have hemoglobin, which of course is composed of iron, which is what then attracts and binds the oxygen, so that the hemoglobin in the red blood cell can transport the oxygen around in the body. Okay, what she's proposed is that upon the death of the animal, the red blood cells ruptured and they released the hemoglobin, which released the iron. In biological systems, iron can catalyze what's called a Fenton reaction. And this reaction, in essence, just causes proteins, for example, to cross-link. So it causes reactions of the proteins so that they actually become more resistant. So in this cross-link state, microbes don't degrade them as fast, enzymes don't degrade them as fast, they just simply don't compose as fast. And so she's proposed that that then explains how they could have lasted millions of years. We reject what she's at least proposed so far because we would say, first off, Fenton reactions are also going to leave signatures. They're going to leave signatures in how they're going to change the chemical state of certain amino acids. And in the protein analysis has been done of like the collagen, for example, those amino acids in that protein don't have that altered chemical state that you would expect from a Fenton reaction. See, so we're not seeing the footprints that we would expect to see if these reactions were actually causing these massive changes to the proteins that were causing them to be preserved better. We would also say that the models themselves that have been studied take some of this into account. You know, the collagen models, they take into account some of the physical changes that are going to occur to collagen that you would say may make it more resistant to degradation. And yet the studies show that it still doesn't last tens of millions of years. So there is no physical chemical evidence that's going to support the idea that proteins, any protein, is going to be able to last tens of millions of years. It's just strictly an extrapolation. It must last because we know these are old. And there becomes your conundrum. Again, the paradigm driving the conclusion. We also would challenge that the study that Dr. Schweitzer did, she used ostrich blood vessels. And she soaked them in water, soaked them in solutions of iron from hemoglobin, soaked them in various solutions, and then monitored their degradation, how fast they degrade. And she reported that after 2 years, those that were exposed to the iron were, for the most part, undegraded. But first, 2 years at a steady temperature doesn't extrapolate to 65 million years at an unsteady temperature. Second, any technician can tell you that we take great pains in laboratories to preserve cells, to preserve protein, to preserve tissue. We freeze it. We deep freeze it. We freeze it, minus 200 degrees in liquid nitrogen. You don't leave it out. You don't expose it to water. You don't expose it to all the things that, in all honesty, these fossils tended to be exposed to, because everybody knows that accelerates degradation.
So in the normal sense, even someone who holds to a very recent creation, that would lead you to believe that this shouldn't be here either, right? Because even for several thousands of years, you wouldn't expect that.
It certainly would not be your first prediction. Even from a creationist position, we know full well that these fossils are exposed to ground level radiation. In fact, you could take almost any dinosaur fossil and put a Geiger counter against it and it'll light it up, because they've absorbed radiation. So even for 4,000 years, we say, wow, that's still quite a challenge. I think they'd absorb radiation and still. So how are you going to explain 65 million years of exposure to this radiation? And Dr. Schweitzer's iron preservation model doesn't account for that.
So as a microbiologist, when you look at this, the two major paradigms that we have before us, and even though this is surprising, there is a paradigm between these two that better fits the evidence than the other.
I think we understand enough about the process and enough about tissue itself to recognize that the more clear, parsimonious, if you will, the simplest explanation is simply that the fossils aren't as old as they're being claimed to be. And so that clearly, this is in violation of the dating process. It challenges the entire dating process. If the fossils of dinosaurs have been dated incorrectly, which I would say this is clear evidence they have, then it's very likely the fossils of any organism have been dated incorrectly, and therefore then the geologic ages themselves are incorrect. And we have to go back and recognize that they use evolution as their control, if you will. It's the filter. If I don't get a date that fits what evolution expects, then the date is rejected. It doesn't make a difference what the date is. It doesn't make a difference how you came about getting the date if it doesn't fit the filter of evolution, if it doesn't fit what we need. If you have something that's out of the Jurassic, but it's dated at 300 million years, that can't be right. Therefore, it's automatically tossed out. Why can't it be right? Because we have, in the evolutionary assumptions, determined that organisms that lived during the period of the Jurassic are this old. And so it sets then the interpretation for everything. When you have problems like the soft tissue, See, you either have to reject the entire dating process, or you have to reject the soft tissue. You know, you really can't have both. They're trying to have both, but it clearly is one or the other. You know, either the fossils aren't as old as we think they are, or there's some mysterious, unknown, magical process that preserves them. Well, which is more scientific? What we know today, the tissue can't last that long, therefore the fossils can't be that old, regardless of what other dating methods you claim you've used.
The new rave in evolutionism is that birds are just dinosaurs and that dinosaurs evolved into birds. There is a joke that KFC should change its name to KFD, Kentucky Fried Dinosaur. But not all of evolutionary scientists accept this nonsense. A proponent is one renowned ornithologist, Alan Feducci of the University of North Carolina. He recently stated, "The theory that birds are the equivalent of living dinosaurs and that dinosaurs were feathered is full of holes, so much so that creationists have jumped all over it." He further laments, "With the advent of feathered dinosaurs, we are truly witnessing the beginning of the meltdown of the field of paleontology. Those looking for evidence that birds evolved from dinosaurs will be disappointed, because the Creator told us that He created birds before land animals, such as dinosaurs."
This is USA Today. Now look, is that a well-known publication? Okay, this exact article was in, I saw this in MSNBC.com, USA Today, and it was also in, it was in a bunch of really well-known, this is major news here. I mean, it was like, I Googled this and I got tons of results from all different well-known magazines. This was a big discovery back in, let me get the date on this. Looks like April 12th of 2007. This was a big, groundbreaking discovery. It says the discovery of traces of flesh in a 68 million year old Tyrannosaurus rex bone. So you hear that? Tyrannosaurus rex. 68 million years old. It says, ties the king of dinosaurs to modern day species. This is pretty interesting, right? I mean, the king of dinosaurs, is being related and tied unto modern day species. What do you think it's tied to? I'm trying to think of animals that could resemble like a Tyrannosaurus rex. What?
Gecko.
Well, I mean, we're talking about Tyrannosaurus rex here. Huh?
Alligator.
You're trying to think of big reptiles and big animals. Okay. Well, it says this is a milestone in paleontology. Okay. It says here, based on the small samples we've recovered, because this is what it is. They found this bone. I'll just break it down for you. They found this bone, okay? And they dug it. It's like this giant bone, because it's from a Tyrannosaurus rex. It's 68 million years old. And they went inside this bone. Even though it's been sitting out for 68 million years, there was a little bit of protein left in the bone. A little meat on the bone, as it were. Okay? They were able to find, because they were like dipping it in acid, and they found like this little soft part, and they're like, wow, this is some of the actual protein from the Tyrannosaurus rex itself. So they're really excited. I mean, this is like flesh. Not really, but it's just a little protein or whatever. Just a tiny bit of this thing's substance, not just a dry old fossil bone. So they pull this thing out, they're going to run all kinds of tests on it, and they start running their tests on this slimy material or this protein that was in the bone. And they start to realize, wait a minute, this is related to a modern day animal. Based on the small sample we've recovered, chickens may be the closest relative to T-Rex. This is amazing, this is a milestone. Chickens. Does it taste like chicken? I mean, think about it. Can it be any stupider? I literally think that these guys just sit around. I think it's like Adolf Hitler said. If you tell a bigger lie, people are more likely to believe a big lie than a little lie. I literally think that they just make this stuff up. I mean, you can't make it up. You'd have to be on drugs or high to make this stuff up. I mean, are these guys just totally drunk? Totally on drugs, just sitting around like,
Hey, what animals should we say? And hey, I always thought that the arms on the Tyrannosaurus Rex, they kind of do look like a chicken. Those little tiny chicken feet that kind of hang out front. I mean, this is in USA Today. This is wisdom, but the Bible's a fairy tale. The Bible's a myth, okay? Science has proven the Bible false right here. So chickens are the closest relatives to T-Rex. Who knows? Maybe T-Rex didn't go extinct. Maybe he just evolved into a chicken. You know? In studies reported to the Journal of Science, Asar and colleagues concluded that 7 traces of proteins detected in purified T-Rex bone must most closely match those reported in chickens. But it also looks like a close runner-up is a frog. Okay, it says that the runner-up is frog, and the third runner-up is a newt, which is like an amphibious salamander. These are the common relatives. I'm just surprised that a chicken and frog are related. You know, and here's the thing: I've decided I'm not an artist. Is anybody in here an artist? Like you can draw pretty well? Because I've got an art Trent. Okay, I've got an art project for you, Trent. You know that real famous picture of the monkey like turning into a man, or the ape? You know, he's like slowly turning into a man. I want to see a Tyrannosaurus Rex slowly adapting until it's a chicken. Okay? That'd be a pretty cool poster.
This is probably one of the most simple and basic evidences that dinosaurs lived with man. This is the original photo, found in Utah. The Native Americans drew it on a stone. They actually used a pecking mechanism to pound this into the rock. Anybody can look at this image and realize that it's a dinosaur. You could show it to a 5-year-old and they will recognize it as a dinosaur. It even has a face on it. You can see the mouth and eyes. When a skeptic looks at this, however, they don't see it. I don't know why, but they don't. As a matter of fact, a lot of them say no, what they were actually drawing was probably just a lizard. Well, I'm not convinced of this argument because look, you can tell they know what a lizard looks like. Here's a goat. Here are some snakes. Yet, look at this. So I believe they drew what they saw, and this video will be my theory. See, to make rock carving images, ancient natives used an object to chip away the original rock in a process called pecking, which leaves behind tiny holes or divots. In a recent report, researchers tried to discredit this interesting depiction of a dinosaur by saying the legs are not part of the image, they are not pecked or otherwise man-made, but they are stained of mud or some other light-colored material or mineral. As their sketch here shows, they maintain that what looks like a dinosaur is really just a snake glyph with a stain below it. Evolutionary biologist Phil Sinter co-authored a paper in an online journal, asserted the theropod-like image was not what it appears to be. They wrote that it is a composite of 2 separate petroglyphs, and that its apparent legs were created by a mud or mineral stain. They claim that this artifact is now officially discredited, which of course would be the sigh of relief news for evolutionists and dinosaur age, and bad news for the creation model of Earth's history. Fortunately, since the method used in the study was basically done just by looking at the artifact, virtually anyone can cross-check the author's observation, which is exactly what has been done, with common sense test. But first, they lie about the lower body portion only being stained, and no peck marks making up the lower body, as peck marks extend down into the presumed body of the petroglyph, even extending down into the area where the legs are, contrary to what they tell the public. Here are some pictures of this. Daryl Robbins documented this petroglyph in the summer of 2010. The body and leg area pecking divots were obvious to Robbins, who after reading Center's report replied, "From my picture, it is clear that the whole dinosaur shape is chipped into the rock surface, not just a mud stain. It's pretty sad when a lowly IT guy does better scientific investigations than scientists." There is a difference between being debunked and being declared debunked. This petroglyph has not really been discredited as a dinosaur except through mass media. They know that the average person cannot access these easily without a ladder to see them for themselves, so they know that they can just get away with saying what they want and people will just believe it. Similar to what evolutionary theory has become today, belief and imagination about something that happened that is not observable or testable or repeatable. So upon a huge ledge, where this petroglyph is, that depicts this large dinosaur, Jan Cameron did an extensive rock art rubbing of the dinosaur image. She was commissioned by a Canadian government to do a rock art rubbing on fossils because it picked up details that the human eye cannot see. Her scientific analysis absolutely reveals that it is a dinosaur. The dinosaur image was made using a hammer, stone, and a deer antler tint. They would peck hundreds of holes to get the proper texture and create the image seen still today on these rock formations. So when someone can walk up, place a sheet of thick paper over the image and rub chalk over it and get the perfect image of a dinosaur, including using USB portable microscopes and multiple gauge tools to help verify that it is indeed what it looks like, then why believe the so-called experts who just walked up, looked at it, and wielded some story without conducting any scientific experiments? Oh, that's right, never mind, don't question them. They're the paid, true experts. Now, let's give them this and say that the image of this dinosaur is not a dinosaur, and it is a complete fraud, even though that's not true. Now we have a huge problem as well for them, because there's a second sauropod dinosaur immediately to its right of the first, with its head turned back looking at the other, and its tail going underneath the neck of the first. So now they have to discredit two dinosaurs, which they never show nor talk about in pictures, both with peck marks that are made up of their entire bodies, not stains. Stack this with the other evidence of Native American artifacts and the scientific discovery of sauropod coprolites in the area, then the evolutionary dogma of 65-million-year-old dinosaur crumbles. I urge you to return to common sense. If you want to let them sprinkle on academic stupidity dust on it and just let them lie to you and try to jam another rescuing device down your throat, trying to tell you it's anything but what it obviously is, then be my guest. But the obvious peck marks throughout, the clear visual outline, the rock art cast rubbings made, the fact that there are two dinosaurs side by side, and the many photographs taken by many different people that all show it's clearly a dinosaur by anyone who has common sense looking at these things, then I think it's pretty safe to say we don't need the indoctrinated fearmongers to come along and try to tell you it's all made up. I fear evolutionary paleontologists are highly indoctrinated, so they cannot see the obvious sometimes right in front of them. They can suffer from paranoia because the current living dinosaur is a paleontologist's nightmare. It is a smashing blow to evolutionism, which means they would have to admit what they have told everyone was wrong, what they teach is wrong, and what they believe themselves is wrong. Their cognitive dissonance will never allow it. I urge you to investigate Native American legends and artifacts depicting dinosaur-like creatures. It should leave your mind far more open to the possibility that humans depicted what they saw, because no other logical conclusion could be made as to why people worldwide made up such things. People like Bill Nye here state specifically, you never find a higher modern-day animal mixed in with a lower animal from an ancient time period in the fossil record. Well, he is outright wrong, because he, like most people, have never heard of the Ashley phosphate beds of South Carolina, which is a shame, because it is the best piece of evidence to ever exist currently that man has lived alongside of dinosaurs, without question. The Ashley phosphate bed is the largest graveyard ever found. This information has been forgotten by the sands of time, but I am going to bring it back. Today, the Ashley phosphate bed is mined for its high quantities of phosphate, which is being used for fertilizer, so there is great money to be made. These sedimentary layers are huge, covering large portions of the Carolinas and extending into Florida all the way up into Canada. World-famous geologist at the time, Louis Agassiz, described the phosphate beds as the greatest graveyard he had ever known. The phosphate beds are so full of bones that it is believed by scientists that the phosphate itself is made from bone. So, if the Ashley phosphate bed is loaded with such an incredible amount of fossils as to cause the leading geologist and zoologist of his day to call them the greatest graveyard he had ever known, you should ask yourself, why has zero mention of this ever been brought up? The fossils completely ravaged the evolutionary timeline. That's why. Remember, if the geologic column is out of place, even in one area on Earth, then it falsifies the theory of evolution, and that the layers formed slowly and that they represent time. Well, when you look at this one place where there's an 18-inch thick layer, you will see why it's suppressed. In it are rare fossils of everything from whales and porpoises, fish, sharks, megalodon shark, toads, crocodiles, alligators, turtles, rabbits, monkeys, horses, camels, elephants, mammoth, mastodon, rhinoceroses, giant sloth, muskrats, deer, pig, dogs, hadrosaur dinosaurs, iguanodon dinosaurs, plesiosauruses, ichthyosaurs, and human bones, teeth, and artifacts, all within the same layer. Professor S.F. Holmes, the paleontologist and curator of the College of Charleston's National History Museum, described the fossil graveyard in a report to the Academy of Natural Sciences. He stated, "Remains of the hog, the horse, and other animals of recent date, together with human bones mingled in with the bones of mastodon and extinct giant lizards." And this is on record. The occurrence of a hadrosaur dinosaur remains in the Ashley phosphate beds has not been dealt with in the secular science literature really at all. Only 2 sources exist. They have kept it silent, which is typical. The sad part is, when they first uncovered the relics of the human bone, they immediately became afraid. They, without hesitation, considered their jobs to be at a loss, so they said that the bone was out of place to one another. They immediately threw it in the river to be erased from history and hidden from all view. They knew that such a find would cause them to either probably lose their jobs or their grant funding. And this is all the way back in the late 1800s. They were still in fear of the government from evolutionary dogma, as Darwin's theory had now taken hold. The scientists who studied this knew exactly what they had found. This is why their deep concern for finding such anomalies. Professor of Geology and Paleontology F.S. Holmes believed in the conventional evolutionary sequence. So he knew full well that humans and dinosaurs should not be found in the same layer. In fact, he wrote, "Not long after finding the above-named relics of human workmanship and engaged in our usual visits to the Ashley bed, a bone was found projecting from the bluff. Immediately in contact with the surface of the stormy stratum, we pulled it out and behold, a human bone. Without hesitation, it was condemned an accidental occupant of quarters to which had no right, geologically, and so we threw it into the river. Alas, we have lived to regret our temerity and rashness. A year later, a lower jawbone with teeth was taken from the same bed, and now we have it in the cabinet." After the news became public, I guess Holmes saw no reasons to cower from his discovery anymore, as Holmes portrayed a dinosaur with a man on the cover of his own book. Evolutionists have admitted that if dinosaurs are ever found with humans, then they would admit that the Noah's flood was real and that man did live alongside of dinosaurs, and that the biblical timeline is true. Because this evidence would validate that the Earth is young and that they had been lied to about our ancient history, there is no rescuing device for them either, because the Ashley phosphate beds had no layers to them. All of the fossils are mixed together in one huge pool of bones, 18 inches thick, covering 200 miles, with no layers found anywhere. The experts who spent considerable time excavating in the phosphate beds have said that there are no layers, and not even a remote resemblance of a layer. It is all one graveyard. You can learn more about the Ashley phosphate bed in a book called Man, Dinosaur, and Mammals Together, written by the late geologist John Watson, available at Mount Blanco Fossil Museum. A statement from the book says, "Since remains of land animals and sea animals were found together, a catastrophic event would have included the burial of enormous numbers of animals, and their subsequent conversion into the rock phosphate over a region of at least 200 miles by 30 miles in extent, which is only partially exposed apart. Such an event is of the order and magnitude of the worldwide Noetic flood." More good evidence is that we also have multiple pieces of physical, observable tracks from around the world where human and dinosaur footprints are found together, and even in some cases overlapping. It would be anecdotal if it was just a single footprint, but we find multiple prints throughout the world and in many different dinosaur strata. Now, if I were to tell a skeptic about this, the first thing that they say is they want visual proof. So, once you supply that, they next claim that it could be anything, even though nothing on Earth looks like a human's foot. But regardless, that's what they say, and this is easy to answer and a rebuttal. The police forensic investigators have actually taken a look at some of these tracks and have confirmed that indeed they are human tracks. So that nullifies their worthless response. The most famous tracks in America, or should I say were in America, are in Glen Rose, Texas. When they first discovered the tracks, it was huge for creationists. They actually called Nova and had them come and film them on site because of this. So Nova was the first to film the dig discovery for each human footprint alongside dinosaur. Creationists insisted that the dig be filmed, telling the public that they wanted verifiable proof through the media live on TV. Unfortunately, there were a couple atheist evolutionists who worked for the company. Nova ended up not doing their job whatsoever, not filming any of the tracks nor the dig. But when they interviewed one another, he was quick to say on live camera that he had not seen anything here to disprove evolution. What he didn't tell the camera was that he had refused to even turn around and look at the tracks that they were working on. When the dig found one, they would tap him on the shoulder and say, "Sir, would you like to take a look at this?" And he would say, "No, I don't want to see it." He stood with his back to the dig and the tracks while making these statements the entire time. After this, they left, and the original photos were taken, which ended up being very important because the very next day, on August 12, 1989, When Don Patterson spoke at the Creation Conference in Dayton, he presented the evidence of pictures to all of the people present. Two well-known evolutionist atheists were present. One of them disrupted the presentation because of their hatred towards creationism. Both had flown from Dallas the morning before and went directly to the Paluxy River. It is reported that they were in the river that afternoon, and one of them, named Glenn Kuban, was with an iron bar, smashing the footprints. 3 days after they had destroyed the footprints, they left. And this is the result we get today. Think about it like this, too, emotionally stunted. If they've only found ever, just recently, I think in 2007, it was the first find of a chimpanzee fossil ever. And it was a tooth found in 2007. They can't even find chimpanzee fossils, and we know that they outnumber humans. So if they can't find even their fossils, obviously finding a human fossil would be very, very hard. But at what you're looking at on my screen is actual evidence of dinosaur with man.
Well, that's an excellent point. Let me interrupt you, and then Matt, I want you to go back to what you're saying. Matt, I've got to interrupt you for a second, but I want you to continue what you're saying because I want to point something out. What you just said is fantastic.
Thanks.
If chimpanzees and humans came from a common ancestor 2.4 million years ago, which is now the current number, they keep pushing it back. 15 years ago, 25 years ago it was less than a million years ago. It was like 250 to 400,000 years ago. Now they're saying 2.4 million years possibly ago when humans and chimpanzees diverged from a common ancestor, right? Okay, so let's imagine that. Now, if that were true, how come there is no human and chimpanzee fossil found together in the same strata? Because they would have coexisted at some point during that transitionary period. And that's the point that Matt was just making. And it's an excellent point. Excellent point. Okay, so I'm done. Sorry to interrupt you, Matt. Please continue. That was a great point.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was trying to think like, okay, well, they get so mad that the humans aren't being found, then obviously there should be evidence for this. So when you look for evidence, you have to go farther back as well, because we're just looking for modern day things. And when you go into Google, obviously the old data is harder to find because they every month, every year it's updated. It's what people want to review. But if you actually look at this was back in 1870, and this is in South Carolina, one of the largest dinosaur fossil beds that they've ever discovered. And inside of it is very interesting. If I take you over here and take you to page 65, what you're going to do is I'm going to send everybody this link right now. I'm going to first give it to everybody here in this chat, and then I'll give it to everybody watching right now on the side. And what this is in the Ashley phosphate bed is the first incident when they found man with dinosaur. And it starts, I believe, on page 65. What they did is the geologist went in and they wanted to excavate, and they were paid to go down and find what fossils were here, and they're investigating. And what they did is they dug underneath a tree and they found some arrowheads and they found human bones. But the strata that they were digging in was occupied by dinosaurs. So they said, obviously this isn't true, and we don't want to lose our jobs. So what we're going to do is we're going to throw these in the river because we can't. This obviously can't be true. So they disposed of everything in the river. Well, when they kept digging down, they went lower and lower and lower. And guess what? They found more human bones with dinosaurs, with sharks, with goats, and modern day things all together because it's one of the largest dinosaur beds that you can find. They said, well, we can't hide it anymore. There's no reason we need to completely keep destroying evidence. So they finally released it to the public. And this is back in 1870. So nobody really knows about this. And I gave you guys the actual link to the
I've read about it.
Archives.
Yeah, it's astonishing. That is one of the earlier examples of evolutionists attempting to destroy the evidence for the flood of Noah by discarding it, destroying it, hiding it, taking it away, getting rid of it. They do this all the time. and they're still doing it today. There was an evolutionist that ran out to the Paluxy tracks of the human and dinosaur fossils in the numerous various layers. There's 2 layers of it in the Paluxy riverbed, and with a crowbar, and began smacking on them and banging on them with a crowbar to destroy them, because he couldn't stand the idea that there was physical evidence to prove man walked with dinosaurs. So he was attempting to destroy it.
But I do want to ask, because that is some pretty extraordinary evidence there, and actually Matt's the first one to show me that too, which it's amazing. I would be curious, for one, what do the evolutionists say of this, and then emotionally stunted emoticon, what do you make of it? And if it is true and factual, and you can, I guess, source check that, what would that? What would you say to that? Would that be sufficient evidence for you, my man?
Right. So again, I'll have to check it out. But it said they found humans with dinosaurs in the same layer.
Well, I have to know a lot about those tracks. A lot. So if you want to ask me about those tracks, ask me any time.
So we'd have to investigate what caused the humans to be there. Remember, erosion and so on takes place where earth that was beneath can be exposed, and then the process happens again. So we need first to investigate how they were buried and so on. So yes, if it is true that they were buried by the same thing around the same time, then that would demonstrate that man lived.
Can I say something to you, emotionally stunted?
Why do we have a geology book? Leonard, did you throw a children's party while I was in Texas?
Wait, what's wrong with geology?
Let me put this in a way you'll understand, Penny. You remember how you explained to me that the Kardashians aren't real celebrities? Well, geology is the Kardashians of science.
Peter Bilmer also wrote in on Facebook, apropos science educators or people who pretend to be one. A creepy YouTube atheist claims that a geological formation known as the Ashley Phosphate Beds is composed of invisible layers, proving deep time. Can you address that claim? Is that because every evidence for evolutionism is in fact invisible and has to be imagined? Well, thanks for writing in, Peter. The Ashley Phosphate Beds are a layer of sediments which are being mined today for its high quantities of phosphate, which is being used for fertilizer. These sedimentary layers are huge, covering large portions of the Carolinas and quite probably extending into Florida and up into Canada. The world-famous geologist Louis Agassiz described the phosphate beds as the greatest graveyard he had ever known. The phosphate beds have so many fossil bones in them that it's believed the phosphate itself is from bones. So, if the Ashley Phosphate Beds are so loaded with such incredible fossils as to cause one of the leading geologists and zoologists of his day to call them the greatest graveyard he had ever known, why then has virtually zero been written about the fossils in the scientific literature? When you look at what was written in the 1800s, you'll probably quickly deduce why. The fossils completely ravage the evolutionary timeline. In that 18-inch thick layer, there has been found together the bones of whales, porpoises, fish, sharks, and ray sharks, including the gigantic shark Megalodon, toads, crocodiles, alligators, turtles, rabbits, monkeys, horses, tapirs, camels, elephants, rhinoceroses, mammoths and mastodons, sloths, muskrats, deer, pigs, dogs, sheep, hadrosaur dinosaurs, iguanodon dinosaurs, what are commonly called marine dinosaurs like the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, and yes, human bones, teeth, and artifacts. That's right, dinosaurs, mammoths, marine reptiles from the alleged dinosaur period, and humans, all found in the same layer. As many leading evolutionists have acknowledged, if humans and dinosaurs were found together, it would demonstrate that the Earth was young. It would refute the millions of years and would refute evolution. Creation would be vindicated. So how does this atheist answer this powerful evidence, refuting evolution and affirming a young Earth and creation? By claiming that there are layers to the Ashley phosphate beds, and that the marine dinosaurs, the mammoths, and the human fossils are actually separated into these individual layers. You just can't see the layers. Invisible layers. Good explanation. This bizarre explanation gets even weirder when you consider the layer average is a whopping 18 inches thick. That's a lot of invisible layers compressed into 1.5 feet of sediments. And this would also mean that the scientists who have studied it were completely blind to these layers, which is ridiculous, seeing as how they'd studied layers elsewhere and this layer was only 18 inches thick. Professor of Geology and Paleontology, F.S. Holmes, believed in the conventional evolutionary sequence, so he knew full well that humans and dinosaurs should not be found in the same layer. In fact, he wrote, "Not long after finding the above-named relics of human workmanship, and engaged in our usual visits to the Ashley bed, a bone was found projecting from the bluff, immediately in contact with the surface of the stony stratum, the phosphate rocks. We pulled it out, and behold, a human bone. Without hesitation, it was condemned as an accidental occupant of quarters to which it had no right, geologically, and so we threw it into the river. Alas, we have lived to regret our temerity and rashness. A year after, a lower jawbone with teeth was taken from the same bed, and now we have it in the cabinet." In fact, Holmes even portrayed a dinosaur and a human on the cover of his book. The only people claiming invisible layers is creepy internet atheists. Others, like Holmes, have at least tried to explain the way the fossils found together as perhaps fossils that were worked out of older and younger rocks to be washed together. Now, this theory also just plain doesn't work, and I don't have time to get into explaining that today, but it shows you that these experts who spent considerable time excavating in the phosphate beds obviously didn't think there was multiple layers there, contrary to the ignoramuses on YouTube, who obviously don't even know how to use Google to find basic information about the Ashley phosphate beds. You can read more on the Ashley phosphate beds in the book written by the late geologist John Watson, Man, Dinosaurs and Mammals Together, available at the Mount Blanco Fossil Museum.
Okay, well, you know what? We'll go on to the next question then. This one is from Guzman, 1611. Guzman asks Esteban, what is his explanation for the human artifacts and bones found in the South Carolina phosphate beds, which contains dinosaur bones? Go ahead, Esteban.
Oh, wow. So specific. I guess, okay. They contain dinosaur bones. What, modern dinosaurs? Like the birds? Human bones have never been found in the same strata as dinosaurs, unless there was an earthquake or some kind of crazy event that turned things up. I don't know anything about this specific case. Again, it's so specific, like I know all this stuff, but so I can't really speak on that specific thing. You know what I mean? I don't want to sound like I think I know everything or anything like that. Humility, you know.
Well, thanks for that answer there, Esteban. Did you have a quick response, Dr. Hovind?
Yeah, the phosphate beds in South Carolina that were mined out mostly about 100 years ago, they were digging out phosphates. There are many books have been written about it. I've got a couple in my library here about them finding all sorts of strange things in these phosphate beds, including dinosaur, human artifacts, and dinosaur bones have been found together. Esteban, if somebody told you dinosaurs, and I don't mean birds are not dinosaurs. That's one of the really dumbest theories they've come up with. But dinosaurs, giant reptiles, have been found. There's evidence of them living with man from all over the world from many sources. They always lived with man. The Bible says everything was made in 6 days, and the phosphate beds are just one of thousands of examples where there's evidence, physical evidence of them living together. I will point out, I don't think anybody has ever in the world found human bones and chicken bones in the same rock strata. Would that prove humans and chickens did not live at the same time? Would that be a logical conclusion? We got chickens in our yard over here. No, they did live at the same time, but you don't normally find their bones together when a catastrophe, because humans don't hang out with chickens a lot. So the fact that bones are not found together is not an evidence against them living together. I don't know how you guys can't see the third grade level common sense behind that. However, with that said, I will say I think they have been found together, and the Carolina phosphate beds are one of many examples of that.
You can find almost anything if you look in the fossil record that resembles something else. That means nothing. Paleontologist Lawrence Whitmer of Ohio University, in a commentary, stated, "Perhaps the time has come to finally accept that Archaeopteryx was just another small, feathered, bird-like theropod fluttering around in the Jurassic." What do evolutionists say about fully modern birds found in the early strata before Archaeopteryx supposedly evolved these fused fingers together? You guessed it, nothing. Stephen Jay Gould said, "It's a curious mosaic, not a transitional fossil." Even the stinkbird, alive today, is a species of tropical bird found in swamps, forests, and mangroves in the Amazon and in South America. It is notable for having chicks that possess claws. The truth? Hand claws are actually widespread in modern birds, and not all that unusual. Ornithologists say Archaeopteryx is a bird, as where paleontologists say it's a dinosaur. Not even a consensus between the sciences. The new rave in evolutionism is that birds are just dinosaurs, and that dinosaurs evolved into birds. There is a joke that KFC should change its name to KFD, Kentucky Fried Dinosaur. But not all of evolutionary scientists accept this nonsense. A proponent is one renowned ornithologist, Alan Feducci of the University of North Carolina. He recently stated, "The theory that birds are the equivalent of living dinosaurs and that dinosaurs were feathered is full of holes, so much so that creationists have jumped all over it." He further laments, "With the advent of feathered dinosaurs, we are truly witnessing the beginning of the meltdown of the field of paleontology. Those looking for evidence that birds evolved from dinosaurs will be disappointed, because the Creator told us that He created birds before land animals, such as dinosaurs." In 1994, the esteemed journal Science shocked the scientific world by publishing sequence data from DNA retrieved from dinosaur bone thought to be 80 million years old. DNA is a fragile molecule, and so it breaks down quickly. Measurements of DNA stability suggest that it could only last thousands of years, at best, only under perfect conditions. But 80 million years was just too incredible for skeptical scientists. Eventually, these skeptics were vindicated, as it became apparent that the original researchers had sequenced contaminated human DNA, not dinosaur DNA. However, in 2012, a different group of researchers published new results supporting the discovery of actual dinosaur DNA. These new results eventually became impossible to disprove or avoid, with the researchers applying multiple checks against contamination from non-dinosaur sources. The preservation of dinosaur DNA doesn't make any sense from an evolutionary perspective, but it fits the biblical history whereby dinosaurs lived thousands of years ago, not millions of years ago. Evolutionists have to invoke rescuing devices to get around these problems, like usual. How do you think our view of dinosaurs would change if everyone knew scientists found carbon-14 in their bones? Well, a group of geophysicists have discovered exactly that, carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. This is indeed a shocking proposal for those who believe that the last dinosaur died out 65 million years ago, because carbon-14 decays so fast that it could not possibly survive that long. There should be not one atom of carbon-14 present in dinosaur bones if they are really as old as they claim to be. After going to great lengths to rule out contamination, the researchers concluded that they had indeed found carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. These results seriously undermine the evolutionary story of long ages in Earth's history. However, they fit nicely with the biblical history, where dinosaurs lived only thousands of years ago. In the early 90s, researchers from Montana State University made an amazing discovery. Inspecting a piece of T-Rex bone under a microscope, they could hardly believe their eyes. They could see dinosaur red blood cells. This discovery prompted lead scientist Mary Schweitzer to say, "It is exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone, but of course I couldn't believe it." I said to the lab technician, "The bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long?" In a Discover magazine article, Dr. Schweitzer explained further her response. "If you take blood cell samples and you stick them on the shelf, you have nothing recognizable in about a week. Why would there be anything left in dinosaurs? Well, the only reason there would be anything left in dinosaurs comes down to there being iron in the blood. However, this excuse falls short, as you are about to see. But first, let's touch on two other reasons that this cannot happen. As I am explaining these two other major problems with why dinosaur bones cannot be 65 million years old, look at all the findings of soft tissue discovered recently and how they know to look for it now, rather than just assume it doesn't exist at all. Problem number 1. The mostly left-handed amino acids that should be equally right-handed and left-handed if they were Jurassic. They are not there. The laws of chemistry demonstrate that after death, amino acids go back to a 50-50 mixture of right and left-handed amino acids. The England's Royal Society published a time range for when this physical process to occur, which produces totally racemized amino acid in 100,000 to 1 million years maximum. So, obviously, that is not even close to 65 million years old. Another problem, the amino acid methionine is very susceptible to strong oxidizing agents like hydrosol, which would quickly oxidize methionine into methionine sulfoxide. The Nature Communications study results revealed unoxidized methionine in some of the Alberta dinosaur specimens. Also consider this. The research on the Egyptian mummies has established a 10,000-year upper limit for how long biological molecules can survive. Now, back to iron for just a moment. If you want to see the rescuing device for iron preservation fail in real time, it's easy. Just look for yourself. One of the most striking examples of soft tissue preservation in dinosaur fossils. If you look at the photos in the paper, you see no evidence of iron particles. The only place she saw iron was inside partially degraded tissue. You see, iron in blood, which gets released at death, cannot preserve all soft tissue decay for millions of years because it still degrades collagen proteins, which have also been found in some specimens. So while iron might preserve some soft tissue, it obviously is not responsible for all soft tissue preservation. Also consider that iron would be incapable of preserving soft dinosaur tissue if it could actually distribute it from the dinosaur's blood throughout all the tissue. Of course, Mary Schweitzer and her team totally submerged specimens to preserve them to obtain the results they desired. But the only way to accomplish this naturally is distributed by water. Well, guess what? That brings up another huge problem, as water also degrades soft tissue before iron can preserve it. In addition to this, soft tissue has also been found in bones not directly associated with iron-rich blood, like in the bone horn of the Triceratops and bird feathers. The old Earth idea was developed historically, not from letting the physical facts speak for themselves, but by imposing anti-biblical philosophical assumptions onto their geological observations, the idea driving the conclusion. The new rave in evolutionism is that birds are just dinosaurs and that dinosaurs evolved into birds. There is a joke that KFC should change its name to KFD, Kentucky Fried Dinosaur. But not all of evolutionary scientists accept this nonsense. A proponent is one renowned ornithologist, Alan Feducci of the University of North Carolina. He recently stated, "The theory that birds are the equivalent of living dinosaurs and that dinosaurs were feathered is full of holes, so much so that creationists have jumped all over it." He further laments, "With the advent of feathered dinosaurs, we are truly witnessing the beginning of the meltdown of the field of paleontology. Those looking for evidence that birds evolved from dinosaurs will be disappointed, because the Creator told us that He created birds before land animals, such as dinosaurs." The old Earth idea was developed historically, not from letting the physical facts speak for themselves, but by imposing anti-biblical philosophical assumptions onto their geological observations, the idea driving the conclusion.
That was an exciting area for you. I know you were very, this is one of the more fascinating areas, I think, for most people. They're fascinated. They're not unaware of this.
No, I mean, the opportunity to go into the lab with Dr. Kevin Anderson, but his explanation of how that material, the protein in that material, breaks down rapidly. It's not something that survives a long period of time. And in particular, as he was saying, in the hostile environment in which these things are found, and the fact that we're now finding it in other bones. That's a paradigm shift for people who would have never, ever have considered finding soft dinosaur tissue. And so we weren't looking for it.
Right. That's
and,
right.
And now that we're looking for it, well, we're finding this is not an anomaly. This is not a one-off. They even find it in rib bones, smaller rib bones.
That's right. So I found that was interesting because when he originally did this work, he worked with Mark Armitage, who did all the microscopy work. And Mark is an electron microscopist who found this. In fact, that's where all of our video footage came from, was Mark, who was doing the microscopy work out of California, and Kevin, who was doing a lot of the analysis and kind of talking through some of the ways these things could actually potentially have been preserved. And I think that's an interesting point. I don't know if it came out, but the original work had been done by Mary Schweitzer, who is a very respected and very smart paleontologist. But because of her, I think it's her histone, she'd run blood work. She saw and knew what this was, working with Jack Horner, who's actually one of the guys who had advised on Jurassic Park, ironically enough. But Mary Schweitzer knew what she had found, that it either, now of course Mary Schweitzer has embraced and has holds on to the paradigm, and understandably so, of an old Earth, and therefore buys into the radioisotope dating, saying that, well, they've got to be old. And so she's looking for what is the mechanism. But that's the problem, is that what was fascinating is when you look at the psychology of the speakers, people who, and Kevin gets into this later in the interview, that they rejected this out of hand and said, someone actually said to one of these folks who was looking at this, who had said, well, it's bacteria, well, it's bird dropping, well, it's someone's lunch, I mean, all kind of bizarre things were told to her, criticizing her. And someone once said, was asking, well, what would it take for you to believe that this was really dinosaur tissue? And he said, nothing. Nothing. It reminds me of Stephen Gould saying, well, I'm just not going to go there.
That's right.
And because they understood it. Well, what's fascinating when you get into this is people who withdrew views that said, well, I only know these proteins could last, 100,000, a million years, and they just have stopped talking about it. She's done a lot of work in the iron model to try to say, okay, we're going to take ostrich vein vessels and let's preserve them in an iron. The problem I always had with this is like, well, that's not how they were found. And this idea of, and then what no one seemed to talk about is radiation. That the levels of uranium and thorium in the soil, I think there's a scientist that talks about this, you can put, apparently, I've not done this, a Geiger counter up against many fossils bones, and it lights up. Meaning, if, and let's just take the paradigm, it really is 65 million years old, well, the amount of uranium and thorium and all the things that we know, we often have people getting radon, just checking in our own homes, so we don't want the levels, that's all in there. So basically, the idea of gamma rays and beta waves that will be going through and destroying this tissue for 65, 75 million years, that's really extraordinary. And no one has explained how, what is it, lead encased now too, and what is this? And then you have the reality of how they're found, and there's so much of them. Now, I think Kevin's right. It's very hard to understand even how in 5,000 and 6,000 years this would be. I think it's reasonable.
Right, even from near term.
Why would it even be there near term? But I think it's very curious with all this curious things going on radiologically during the flood and the things happening. There's something there potentially, some reasoning that I think that the creationists will likely have better models to explain this eventually. And
this also brings us back again to the paradigms and the power of paradigms, because not only does this lie outside of a deep time paradigm, you would never predict, you would never expect, and even after it's happened, you would deny. You'd say somebody's lunch, that it doesn't fit in there. Well, then that also leads us to understand why, I think it was Dr. Anderson who was telling us, that for years and years, the published reports was that there was no radiocarbon in those bones. Well, when they went back and looked at the raw data, they said there was, because now
they have to get.
Well, what happens?
They're adjusting them. Everything gets adjusted to a standard because they're like, well, there can't be radiocarbon in it, so if we're getting it, it's not there.
It's an anomaly. It doesn't fit, and so forth. So it doesn't get reported. And so it's not out of meanness. It's just that it doesn't. It's something weird, and so now we go back and say, well, my goodness, now there's radiocarbon in here, which shouldn't be there. Especially if you're talking about millions, 60, 70, 80 millions of years. By that, radiocarbon has such a small half-life. It should be gone, but it isn't. And so now we have soft dinosaur tissue, we have radiocarbon in there, which is saying that these may not be as old as what we've been told. And so all of a sudden, these are one of those anomalies. This is the anomalies piling up.
Correct. One after the other.
That begin to shake a paradigm.
Well, it is, and I think that the important thing here is to realize that it isn't that one believes based on the data. One believes the paradigm first, and then begins to look at the data. But some paradigms will be better fit by other data, just as history shows us that there are some paradigms that really are fairly weak, even though they may be functional for a period of time. And I think that that's a fair thing to say about the Darwinian paradigm. It wasn't that it was all wrong and everything. I don't think it is. I think that it's not nearly as accurate a view as the creation view. No, and it leaves many things out, and that there's some smart people who are very done wonderful work. And I love reading. To be honest, Donald Prothero. Oh, I love reading his stuff. He hates creationists. I love his books, because I think he's a scientist that's really interested in these things. Stephen Jay Gould, I can go down the list of secular science that I like to read, seeing through them, through how they talk about the data and knowing, oh, well, this could be looked at this way, and you're just spinning it this way. Now, I don't spin not the right word, interpreting it that way. Sometimes more validly than others.
No, it's just like somebody who studies heat in air. And we study it and we realize, because in our homes we know that when air heats up, it rises to the top. Well, that's true. You're not stupid, you see it, you can tell that. But if all of a sudden you then say, well, then if we go to the top of the Himalayas, it's going to be really hot up there. When all of a sudden we find that that doesn't work. Well, it's an anomaly. And so we figure out, okay, why is that the case if hot air rises? And the same is true with ice. You know, that as water gets colder and colder, it gets denser and denser. Well, if you study it in a small section, that's really true. And that's exactly what happened. And water, as it gets colder and colder, it sinks to the bottom. But then as it begins to solidify, it changes and it begins to float. Thankfully, otherwise life couldn't exist because ice would be on the bottom. But it's what happens when a paradigm all of a sudden begins to get data outside of its range. It's not that there's something wrong with your study here. It's not that you don't understand heat and cold temperatures and how it applies to the molecular activity of water, but you understood it within a particular range, and now all of a sudden it begins to change. And now we have the same situation. You know, now
well, it is. But I think that the issue here in terms of the empirical data of stuff and then historical science is an important distinction. And that's really what we try to do with these first sections, starting from Mount St. Helens and going all the way to soft tissue. That's really our first part of the film, if you will, where you deal with the geology and you deal with the catastrophe. And it's this idea that the geological sciences are historical sciences. So you can't go do any of these experiments exactly the same way. And the paradigm that's driving it is reinterpreting all of this historical data. And so what I wanted to demonstrate is that catastrophe and large flood events and the text and the fossil record and all of the materials inside those, they all fit in you can look at them together and realize, well, there's actually a consilience, if you will, a jumping together of things that make a lot of sense with this biblical history. And furthermore, it's a history that's now being put against a history, the natural history. And it goes back to that paradigm that this is not about philosophies, essentially. It's about adopted a history. And that's really what that first section is that I feel like the soft tissue basically is the nail in the coffin. In my opinion, that we've established all these points and it's like, okay, let's just shut this lid. I don't think this is the best accurate view of history because time comes from the rocks. It doesn't come from anywhere else. It comes from the rocks based on this earth. And we're not talking about the heavens right now. But if you're on the earth, it's on the rocks.